Chapter 4. Ingunn was thinking of Eirik now, night and day. This too had grown pale and unreal to her in the first happy days. That she had had a little son who slept in her arm, sucked her breast and lay against her, small and soft and warm, and she breathed the sourish milky scent of him as she flooded him with her tears in the blind dark nights. And she had parted from him, as though tearing herself in two, before she faced the final horror and the outer darkness. But all these horrors lay sunk beneath the horizon of her fevered nights of darkness and tumult, when she was tossed high and drawn down into the abyss by waves of dizzy swooning. When she came back into the light of day, Olav was there and took her to him. When she was made happy, it was as though the hapless being of her memory were not herself. Weeks passed without her thinking once of the child, as though she wondered vaguely and almost indifferently, is he still alive? And she would not have been greatly moved, she thought, if she had heard that he was dead. But then it might chance that an uneasy thought stirred within her. How is he? Is Eirik well? Or is he ill-treated amongst strangers? And from the pale and distant memories of last year's misery one shot out and came to life. The little persistent scream that nothing could quiet but her breast. The truth smote her with a cruel stab. She was a mother to a whimpering babe that had been flung out among strangers far away, and perhaps at that moment was screaming himself hoarse and tired for his mother. But she thrust these thoughts from her with all her might. The foster mother had a kind look, so perhaps she was more charitable than the mother who had brought the child into the world. No. She thrust the thought aside, away with it, and the memory of Eirik faded out again. And here she was at Hestviken, as Olav's wife, in all good fortune, and she felt her youth and beauty flourish anew. She bent her head, radiant with bashful joy, if her husband did but look at her. But the new child grew within her. From being a secret, wasting exhaustion which turned her giddy and sick with fear of the night shadows it might conjure up to stand between Olav and herself, it had become a burden which weighed upon her and obstructed her whenever she would move. And meanwhile, the most important thing about her now in the eyes of everyone was that she should bring new life into the old stock. Olav Ingolfsson talked of nothing else. Had she been Queen of Norway, and had the people's hopes of peace and prosperity for generations been centred on the expected child, the old man could not have regarded the coming event as more momentous. But the neighbours, too, when they met the young mistress, let her know that they counted this glad tidings. Olav Audunsson, since he was 7 years old, had been the only one on whom rested the hope of carrying on the Hestvik race, and ever since that time he had wandered far from the spot where his home was. After 20 years of roaming he had come back to the land of his ancestors. When children began to grow up around him and his wife, something that had long been out of joint would be put right again. Her own household also took their share in what awaited their mistress. They had liked Ingunn from the first, because she was so charming to look at, kind and well-intentioned, and they had pitied her a little for being so utterly unfitted for all the work of her house. And now they pitied her, seeing her sorry state. She turned pale as a corpse if she did but enter the cookhouse when they were cooking seal meat or seabirds. She was not used to this oily smell in the food where she came from, she murmured. The maids laughed and pushed her out. "We will get through it without you, mistress." She could not stand up to serve out the meat without the sweat bursting out on her face. The old dairy woman gently pressed her into a seat on the bench and stuffed cushions behind her back. "Let me be carver today, Ingunn. You can scarce stand on your feet, poor child." She laughed, seeing that the mistress was shaking with weariness, and they were fearful how it would go with her. She did not look as if she could bear much more, and it was over 3 months to her time, from what she herself said. Olaf was the only one who never showed sign of joy at the expected child. He never uttered a word about it, and his household saw that well. But Ingunn thought in her heart that, when once the boy came into the world, he would be no less wonderful in his father's eyes than in those of all the others. And the bitterness at which she herself was terrified welled up anew. Not a spark of affection did she feel for the child she bore, but a yearning for Eirik and a grudge against this new baby, whom every good thing awaited and all were ready to caress when he came. And it seemed to her as though it were the fault of this child that Eirik was cast out into the darkness. When she felt that folk looked kindly upon her, took pains to clear her path and make things easy for her, the thought struck her. When Eirik was to be born, I had to hide myself in corners. The eyes of all stoned me with scorn and anger and sorrow and shame. Eirik was hated by everyone before he was born. I hated him myself. As she sat at her sewing, she recalled how she had staggered from wall to wall when the first pangs came upon her. Tora made up a bundle of swaddling clothes, the worst and oldest she had left over from her own babies. And she, the mother, had thought they were good enough, and more, for this one. The maid sitting with her looked in astonishment at her mistress. Ingunn tore impatiently at the fine woolen swathing she was sewing and threw it from her. Now he was a year old, a little more. Ingunn sat out of doors the first summer evening, watching the little child, Bjorn's and Gudrid's youngest, as he stumbled about, fell and picked himself up, stumped on, and tumbled again in the soft green grass of the yard. She did not hear a word of all Gudrid's chatter. My Eirik, barefoot, poorly clad like this one here, with his poor foster parents. Old Olav died in early July, and Olav Audunsson made a goodly funeral feast for him. Among the ladies who came out to Hestviken to help Ingunn with the preparations was Sigrid Undset, who was newly married and mistress of Stikkjustad. Her younger sister Una was with her, and when the guests were leaving, Olaf persuaded Arn and the priest to let Una stay behind, so that Ingunn might be spared all toil and trouble at the end of her time. Olaf was somewhat vexed, for he could not help seeing that Ingunn did not like the girl. And yet Una was deft and willing to help, cheerful and good to look at, small and delicately built, nimble and quick as a wagtail, fair-haired and bright-eyed. Olaf himself had grown fond of his second cousins. He was slow to make acquaintances with his reserved and taciturn nature, but there were not many folk he disliked. He took them as they came, with their faults and their virtues, was glad to meet them as acquaintances, but not unwilling to make friends with those he liked, if only he were given time to thaw. Olaf Ingolfsson had got together a quantity of good timber, and in the previous autumn Olav Audunsson had already done a good deal to repair the most pressing damage in the houses of the manor. This summer he pulled down the byre and rebuilt it, for the old one was in such a state that the cows stood in a slough of mire in autumn, and in winter the snow drifted in, so that the beasts could hardly have suffered more from cold if they had been out in the open. One Saturday evening the household was assembled in the courtyard. It was fine, warm summer weather, and the air was sweet with the scent of the first haycocks, and the fragrance of lime blossom was wafted down from the cliff behind the outhouses. The byre was set up again, and the first beams of the roof were in place. The heavy roof tree lay with one end on the ground and the other leaning against the gable, as the men had left it when work ceased for the week. Now the two young housecarls took a start and ran up the sloping beam to see how high they could go. Presently the other men joined in, even the master himself. The game went merrily with laughter and shouts whenever one of the men had to jump off. Ingunn and Una were sitting against the wall of the house when Olaf called to the young maid. "Come hither, Una. We will see how sure of feet you are." The girl excused herself with a laugh, but all the men crowded round her. She had laughed at them when they had to jump off halfway up the beam. No doubt she would be able to run right to the top. She would. At last they came and dragged her forcibly from the bench. Laughing, she pushed the men aside, took a run and sprang a little way up, but then she had to jump down. Again she took a run and reached much higher this time, stood swaying for an instant, lithe and slender, waving her outstretched arms, while her little feet in the thin summer shoes, without soles or heels, clutched the beam like the claws of a little bird. But then she had to jump to one side, as a tomtit that cannot get a hold on a log wall. Olaf stood below and caught her. Now the young maid had entered into the sport, and ran up time after time, while Olaf ran backwards below and received her laughing in his arms every time she had to jump down. Neither of them had an idea of anything, till Ingunn stood beside them, panting and white as snow beneath her freckles. "Stop it now," she whispered, catching at her breath. "There is no danger, I tell you." Olaf comforted her with a laugh. "Don't you see that I can catch her?" "I do see it." Olaf looked at his wife in astonishment. She was on the point of tears, he could hear. Then she burst out in mingled sobs and scornful laughter, with a toss of the head toward the girl. "Look at her. She is not so foolish, but she has the wit to be ashamed." Olaf turned round to Una. She was red in the face and looked troubled. And slowly a flush rose in the man's cheeks. "Now, I never heard. Are you out of your senses, Ingunn?" "I tell you," cried his wife with a hiss in her voice, "she there. It's not for nothing she comes of Foulbeard's brood, and I think there is more likeness between him and you than—" "Hold your mouth," said Olaf, revolted. "'Tis you should have the wit to be ashamed. Who are you to say such things to me?" He checked himself, seeing her wince as though he had struck her in the face. She seemed to collapse with wretchedness, and her husband took her by the arm. "Come in with me now," he said, not unfriendly, and led her across the yard. She had leaned against him with her eyes closed, so heavy that she could scarcely move her feet. He had almost to carry her, and within himself he was furious. She makes herself out far more wretched than she is. But when he had brought her to a seat on the bench and saw how miserable and happy she looked, he came up and stroked her cheek. "Ingunn, have you clean lost your wits? Can it displease you that I jest and have a little fun with my own kinswoman?" She said nothing, and he went on. "It looks ill, and worse than ill. You must be able to see that yourself. Una has been with us here for 4 weeks, has taken all the work she could from your shoulders, and you reward her in this way. What do you suppose she thinks of this?" "I don't care," said Ingunn. "But I care," answered Olaf sharply. "It is unwise of us too," he went on more gently, "to behave so that we are challenging folk to speak ill of us. Surely you must see that yourself." Olaf went out and found Una in the cookhouse. She was cleaning fish for supper. He went up and stood beside her. The man was so unhappy. He did not know what he was to say. Then she smiled and said, "Think no more of this, kinsman. She cannot help being unreasonable and ill-tempered now, poor woman. The worst is," she added, making the cat jump for a little fish, "that I cannot be of much use here, Olaf, for I saw from the first day that she does not like me being here. So I think it will be wiser if I go to Signy tomorrow. It seems a great shame to me that you should leave us in this way. And what will you say to Signy and to Sire Benedict about your not staying here? You can be sure that they have more wit than to make anything of this than it is." "It will grieve Ingunn most of all," the man exclaimed dolefully, "when she comes to herself again, that she has offended our guest and kinswoman so abominably." "Oh, no, she will scarce remember it." "Don't let this vex you, Olaf." She dried her hands, laid them on his arms, and looked up at him with her bright, pale grey eyes, which were so like his own. "You are kind, Una," he said in a faltering voice, and he bent over her and kissed her on the lips. He had always greeted the sisters with a kiss when they met or parted, but he realized with a faint sweet tremor that this was not the kiss that belongs to courtesy between near kinsfolk, who count themselves something more than cottagers. He let his lips dwell on the fresh, cool, maidenly mouth, unwilling to let go, and he held her slender form to him and felt a subtle, sleeting pleasure in it. "You are kind," he whispered again, and kissed her once more before reluctantly releasing her and going out. There can be no sin in it, he thought with a mocking smile, but he could not forget Una's fresh kiss. It had been, yes, it had been as it should be, but that was a small thing to trouble about. He had been angry with Ingunn, had never believed she could behave so odiously and ridiculously. But no doubt Una was right. There was little count to be taken of what she said or did at this time, poor creature. But when he had accompanied Una to Skiktrudstad the next day after Mass, it was the feast of the translation of St. Olaf, and was riding homeward alone, his anger boiled up anew. Had she come to such a pass that she now suspected him of the worst, simply because she herself had sinned? No. Now he remembered, she had shown his kinswoman ill will before, in the autumn, when there was nothing amiss with her. She was jealous. Even at Fredestein she had been quick to find faults and blemishes in the other women, the few they met. And that was unseemly. Olaf was indignant with his wife. And then the fact that she should mention Torgil's foul beard. All his childhood's vague aversion to the madman had turned to open hate and horror since he had heard the whole story of Torgil's Olafsson. He had been a ravisher whom God struck down at the last, a disgrace to his kin, and he lived in folks' minds, while none remembered the other Olafssons who had lived and died in honour. Surely he might just as well be said to take after them. Olaf was always ill at ease when he heard it hinted he was so like Foulbeard. But he was annoyed with himself for feeling, as it were a cold blast of ghostly terror at the back of his neck when such things were said. His worst enemy could not accuse him of being mad after women. In all the years he had lived in outlawry, he could scarcely recall having looked at a woman. When his uncle Barnum suggested that he ought to take the miller's pretty daughter and keep her at his leman while he was at Hovdingard, he had sharply refused. She was fair, and willing too, as he could see, but he had held himself to be a married man in a way, and he would keep his troth, even if his uncle teased him for it, and laughingly reminded him of Kettelog. This was a poor Vendible girl he had fallen in with one night when he was in the town, in company with other young men from the manor, and they were all dead drunk. In the morning, when he was sober again, he fell to talking with the girl, and after that he had conceived a sort of kindness for her. She was unlike others of her kind, sensible and quiet in her ways, preferring a man who did not care to play the fool and raise a riot in the inn. And then he had continued to look in on her when he was in the town on his uncle's business. Often he simply came in and sat with her, ate the food he had brought, and sent her for ale. He took pleasure in her quiet way of waiting upon him. But his friendship for her had been no heavy sin, and no one in his right mind would assert that he had been unfaithful to Ingunn with her. He had often thought of her, however, in the first years that followed, hoped she had not got into trouble for helping him to get away to the Earl that time. He wished he could have known for certain that she had been able to hide from the others in the inn the money he gave her at parting, and whether she had carried out the plan she often spoke of, that she would turn her back on that inn and seek service with the nuns of St. Clara's convent. In truth, she was far too good to be where she was. It was the sense of this secret guilt that made him insecure. He felt defenceless against the evil one, like a man who must go on fighting though crippled by a secret wound. His wife's prolonged ill health and her unreasonableness, and her being herself the cause that he was never allowed entirely to forget what must be forgotten, all this made him uneasy, wavering in his mind. And he felt a little thrill of pleasure as he remembered how good it had been to hold Una in his arms. It angered him as he thought of Ingunn. It was her senseless behaviour to the kind fair child that had been the cause of this. But he would have to take it patiently. She had so little to comfort her now, Ingunn. But the same evening Ingunn fell sick. It came so suddenly that before the ladies who were to help her could reach the place, it was over. No one but Ingunn's own serving women were with her when the child came, and they were all terrified and bewildered, they told Olav afterwards, with tears in their eyes. They thought the boy was alive when they lifted him up from the floor, but a moment later he was dead. Never, thought Olav, had he seen a creature look so like a piece of broken, washed-out wreckage cast up on the beach, as did Ingunn, lying there, crouched against the wall. Her thick, dark yellow hair lay tousled over the bed, and her dark blue eyes, full of unfathomable distress, stared from her swollen, tear-stained face. Olav seated himself on the edge of the bed, took one of her clammy hands, and laid it on his knee, covering it with his own. One of the weeping maids came in bearing a bundle, unwrapped it, and showed Olav the corpse of his son. Olav looked for a few moments at the little bluish body, and the mother burst into another harrowing fit of weeping. Quickly the man bent over her. "Ingunn, do not grieve so." He himself was unable to feel any real grief over his son. In a way he was fully aware how great was the loss, and his heart was wrung when he reflected that the boy had died unbaptized. But he had never had time for rejoicing in the past months, had felt nothing but a vague and faltering jealousy of what had gone before, anxiety for Ingunn, and a longing for the end of this cheerless time. But he never realized that the end would be the birth of a son in his house, a little boy whom he would bring up to manhood. The mother was not very sick, said the neighbours' wives when they came and nursed her. But when the time came for her to be helped to sit up in bed in the daytime, she had no strength. She was drenched with sweat if she did but try to bind her hair and put on her coif. And Sunday after Sunday went by without her being strong enough to think of churching. Ingunn lay on her bed, fully dressed, with her face turned to the wall the whole day long. She was thinking that she herself had been the cause of this child's death. She had received it with loveless thoughts as it lay within her, groping for its mother's heartstrings, and now it was dead. Had skilful women been here at its birth, it would surely have lived, the neighbours told her. But she had always insisted, when they came to see her this summer, that she did not expect it before St. Bartholomew's Day. For she had been afraid of these wise neighbours of hers, lest they might find out and spread it abroad that Olav Audunsson's wife had had a child before. And the morning she woke up and felt it was coming, she had risen and kept on her feet as long as she was able. But Olav must never know this. But at last it could be put off no longer. It was on the Sunday after Michaelmas that Ingunn Steinfinnsdatter had to submit to be led into church. Olav had learnt that there were 4 other women newly delivered who were to go in. One of them was the daughter-in-law of one of the richest manors of the neighbourhood, and she had just brought an heir into the world. The church would surely be half full of her kinsfolk and friends alone, who would come to make offerings with her. Olav could scarce bring himself to think of Ingunn, kneeling before the church door, poor and empty-handed, while the others bowed to receive the lighted candles, as the Psalm of David was sung over the women. Who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord, or who shall stand in his holy place? He that hath clean hands and a pure heart, he shall receive the blessing from the Lord, and righteousness from the God of his salvation. To Ingunn and him, this would sound like a judgment. Olav had been shy of going near Sira Benedict since the day Ingunn had drove Una Arnesdatter out of their house in such a shameful manner. But now he rode one day up to the priest and begged him to be kind and bring consolation to Ingunn. Sira Benedict had ordered that all corpses of unbaptized children should be buried on the outer side of the churchyard fence. They were not to be hidden under a heap of stones, like cattle that had died a natural death, or buried in waste places like evildoers. He reproved people severely for believing in the ghosts of such children. Dead infants could not appear, he said, for they were in a place which is called limbus puerum, and they will never leave that place, but they are happy and content there. St. Augustine, who is the most excellent of all Christian sages, writes that he would rather be one of these children than never have been born. But if folk have been scared out of their wits and senses in those places where the corpses of infants have been hidden away, it is because they themselves have such sins on their consciences that the devil has power over them to lead them astray. For it is clear that the place where a mother has made away with her baby is well nigh an altar or a church to the devil and all his imps. They are happy to haunt it ever after. The priest consented at once to accompany Olav home. Olav Ingolfsson had firmly believed in infant apparitions and thought indeed that he himself had once laid such a ghost. So Sire Benedict was zealous to dissuade Ingunn from this heresy and give her consolation. The woman sat, white and thin, with her hands folded in her lap, and listened to their parish priest discoursing on the limbus puerorum. It was written of this in a book. A monk in Ireland had been wrapped in an ecstasy 7 days and 7 nights, and he had had a vision of hell and purgatory and heaven. He had also been in the place where are the unbaptized infants. It appears as a green valley, and the sky is always clouded as a sign that they can never attain the bliss of beholding God's countenance. But light is shed down between the clouds, in token that God's goodness dwells upon the children. And the children appeared to be happy and in good case. They do not feel the lack of heaven, for they do not know there is such a place. Nor can they rejoice at being saved from the pains of hell, for they have never heard of it. They play there in the valley and splash water upon one another, for the place is passing rich in brooks and lakes. Olaf interrupted. Then, Sire Benedict, I think that many a man might be tempted to desire he had died an infant and unbaptized. The priest replied, It is so ordained, Olaf, that in our baptism we are called to a great inheritance, and we must pay the price of being men. Are the parents suffered to come thither sometimes? Asked Ingunn in a low voice. To have sight of their children and watch them at play. The priest shook his head. The parents must go their own way, up or down, but it will never take them over that valley. Then I think God is cruel, exclaimed the woman hotly. That is what we human creatures are so prone to say, replied the priest, when he does not grant our desires. Now it was of great moment to you and your husband that this child should have grown to man's estate. He was born to take up a great inheritance and carry on the race. But if a woman bear a child whose only destiny is to be a testimony of her shame, and whose only inheritance is his mother's milk, then her mother's heart is oftentimes not to be depended on. It may be that she will hide herself and give birth to it in secret, destroy the child body and soul, or put it out with strangers, well pleased if she neither hear nor see it any more. Olaf sprang up and caught his wife as she fell forward in a swoon. Kneeling on one knee, he supported her in his arms. The priest bent down and quickly loosened the linen coif which was tightly wound around her neck. With her white face hanging backward over her husband's arm and the bare arch of her throat, she looked as one dead. "Lay her down," said the priest. "No, not upon the bed, on the bench, so she may lie flat." He busied himself with the sick woman. "She is not strong, your wife?" asked the priest as he was about to ride away. Olaf stood holding his horse. "No," he said. "She has always been weak and frail. You know we are foster brother and sister. I have known her from childhood.